Hello everyone. Okay, can everyone see and hear me okay? Very good. And how was everyone's reading week? Very, very good. Very good. I agree, not long enough. I absolutely agree. Oh, same as Noamine says, not long enough. It always seems to go by far too quickly. Um, okay, question. Yanjanani, go ahead.
Hi, I just had a quick question about the essay assignment.
Yep.
I missed the lecture where we went over it. I just want to know the topics that we can choose from.
Well, really, anything is fair game as long as it fits with the themes of the class. But I'm encouraging people to look at the main themes of each chapter. So, for example, if you're looking at the chapter we're examining today, you could do something like realism versus nominalism.
So, for
Uh,
example, like an essay on like the demon argument, for example, and like,
Yeah. You just want to make sure that whatever topic you do, you want to frame it in terms of an argument or in terms of posing and then answering a research question, right? So, um, if you were to do the dream argument, one of the options I'm suggesting to people is comparing that to, say, a film like The Matrix or The Truman Show are each popular. And what you can do is argue that, I don't know, themes of the dream argument and demon argument are present in one of these films, right? So something like that is possible.
and are we only drawing from like stuff from the class, or do you want us to draw from outside sources?
You should be drawing from some outside sources. Yeah.
Okay.
I think
All
I
right.
said in the essay lecture that you should have up to five sources for your essay. And some of those can be chapters from the book, but you also want to get outside of the book.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, and a couple other questions. Yeah, Noamine answered Isaiah's question. You don't have to confirm your topic, but if you're not sure, it's always a good idea to speak with me. Um, and the best way to do that is just send an email or set up a meeting with me, something like that, if you're really not certain. It looks like I've forgotten my coffee over there, so I will leave you with my cat while I go get that. You you stay here, sir. All right. Oh. Yeah, I appreciate that the essay seems like a challenge, but I wouldn't worry too much. Remember, remember that really what I'm trying to get you to do with the essay is to convince me of something to do with the topic you've chosen. And the best approach I think for all of you is to choose a topic that you keep returning to, that you keep thinking about. You find yourself continuously thinking about the dream argument, for example. Write about that, right? If you're stuck on like I don't know, direct versus indirect realism. Think about that, you know, right on the topics you keep returning to. Um, Michael, yes, you'd want to relate it to the things we're learning in class. Um, Coffee simply with cream, although I'll get sugar when I'm out. Um, Yanjanani, go ahead.
And are you also gonna post a marking guide?
Um, I think I've made, or I can make, a rubric available,
Okay.
but I mean, generally, yeah, generally, I have a rubric. It's not my own original rubric, but it is something that I use, um, and that I have my TAs use when we're marking. Um, so I'll make that available if you think that would be helpful.
Yeah, that'd be pretty clutch.
Okay. So I'll make sure to post that. And that'll be in the helpful materials module down at the bottom of the course table of contents.
All right, thanks so much.
You're welcome. Okay, so the topic of today is universals. So we're going to talk about what those are and whether they exist, because they might not. So, what are universals, firstly? Well, notice that in our everyday talk, we can discuss individual things, like, for example, this particular dog having such and such a property, this particular cat over here having such and such a property. I can say that, I don't know, this cat has a red collar, this banana is yellow, things like that. We're talking about individual entities in this case. This coffee is hot, right? But I can also talk about universal things, right? Cats, dogs, humans are all mammals. Bananas, along with apples, pears, tomatoes, and many other things, are all fruits. And here I'm using language to pick out kinds of things that exist, right? And this should all be, I think, really familiar to you all, right? We can talk about individual things in a concrete sense, like this cat over here or this cup of coffee over here on the desk. But I can talk about categories of things or kinds of things in the abstract as well. And when I do that, I'm talking about universal things, not particular objects or individual objects. And when it comes to those individual objects, I can also talk about their properties, right? So I'm not just talking about kinds of things. Um, I'm talking about um, property categories, if you like, or I'm grouping these instantiations of a particular property under a kind, right? So I might have an apple that is green. I may also have an unripened banana that is green, or a pear that is green, or Kermit the Frog, or the plants that are hanging in my window right now. Many of these things are green. So here I've got all these instances of a particular property being green. So I can say that the property of being green is predicable of lots of different objects. I can predicate the property green to many different objects. So green, in this case, the color green, might also refer to a universal. Now, I just want to make sure everyone understands what I'm saying when I say I can predicate, or that these properties are predicable. Okay? So just think back to your, I don't know, your grammar classes, if if that's what they're called. Um, what is a predicate? It's quite straightforward, right? If I say that Kermit the Frog is green, what part of that proposition is the predicate? The is green part, technically. But yeah, green. So I'm properties we can think of as, like I say, predicable in this way. Right? There's a few different ways to understand um properties, but this is what we're working with in this chapter, right? Like I can say that the apple is red. I've predicated the property redness to the apple with language, right? So that's what that means. I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page about that. And when we pick out properties like this is called abstract reference. Or rather, when we refer to the properties themselves. So I can predicate a property like greenness to Kermit the Frog, describing Kermit the Frog. I can say, yeah, Kermit the Frog is green. But if I say green is a color or Kermit is a Muppet, I'm using something called abstract reference, where I'm referring to the properties um, that the objects have, not to the objects themselves. And the properties are abstract, right? I think Crumley explains it something like this, right? If I don't know if he uses I think he uses the example of a vase. So let's say I have a red vase. Now, of course, the vase is red. It has this particular property. I could smash the vase, destroying it, but I haven't destroyed redness, right? It still exists. Redness still exists. At least it seems, in some important abstract sense. And so, um, I can talk about objects, and I can talk about the kinds of properties that they possess in the abstract. Something like, and we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here, but something like what Plato does with the theory of forms. So is anyone familiar with this? The theory of forms. Okay, good. So what's up with the theory of forms? Does somebody want to tell us? Like what did Plato think these forms were? Yeah, like the ideal version of something. Um, yeah, I would say the perfect idea. I wouldn't say mental idea, because Plato thought these things were more real as opposed to ideal, right? Which is weird with Plato, right? Like, because he calls them the forms or ideas. Um, ideas, I believe, comes from like eidos, the thing that is seen in the mind. So, yeah, but the forms are not ideal in the sense that they're mind dependent. For Plato, they actually exist and are more real than the phenomena that we see um, in our sort of changeable, corruptible world that we find ourselves inhabiting, right? So, but for Plato, the point I'm trying to make here is that when we reference a kind of property in the abstract, when we do abstract reference, we're referring to um, something like what Plato thought forms were. So, I can say green is a color. Greenness exists over and above, separate from any green object. So you could think of that along Platonic lines if you wanted to be a realist about this stuff, right? So that's abstract reference when I'm referring to some kind of property rather than the objects that bear that property. Sometimes there can be different instances of the same property. Many things can be green, as we saw earlier, apples, pears, unripe tomatoes, unripe bananas, Muppets, um, all kinds of things. A lot of the plants that I have, all green. So they all share the attribute green. That's called attribute agreement. Very straightforward. So you're probably wondering, like, okay, professor, yeah, I can talk about greenness in the abstract, and lots of things can be green. So what? Right? It seems like so everyday, so mundane. What's the big deal here? Well, the way we think and talk about these properties when we make an abstract reference or when we pick out attribute agreement, linguistically, this raises a metaphysical problem. And that problem is the problem of universals. And I should mention, this is kind of fun, although this textbook chapter might seem a little like, hey, why the hell are we talking about Muppets and the color green so much? Who cares? How is this philosophy? Well, we're actually starting to get into metaphysics. Um, we've been talking about epistemology primarily so far. We get to make our first foray into metaphysics, and we get to do it with a very, I guess, a very old problem. So let's talk about a little bit more terminology. So, as I said before, instances of the same property can occur in different objects in different places at different times, right? And we group them all together, like the color green, green tomatoes, green house plants, green bananas, green Muppets, green cars, green articles of clothing. All of these things have something in common, something something that they share, a property that they share, and that is being green. All of these different instances of green, well, we say that the objects that bear these properties instantiate green or greenness, right? But we can do this with abstract things too, like Plato did, right? I mean, for Plato, there's all kinds of perfect forms, like, well, the three most important might be the good, the true, and the beautiful. Definitely the good is like the ultimate form for Plato, the form of the good. But there's forms for, I think, really anything that can be known via the exercise of the intellect, there's going to be a form for that thing. Mm. Uh, and some things that we know via the senses. This is usually explained, I guess, with something concrete first, like a cup, right? This is a pretty shop-worn example, right? But my coffee cup, if you're Plato, gets its cupness from the form of the cup, which is more perfect than any cup, any actual cup that we have could be. But Plato might say that um, Granny Smith apples, unripened tomatoes, and Kermit the Frog all get their greenness which is a little bit more abstract than a cup or cupness, from the perfect form of the green. But then there's even more abstract forms for Plato. Like there are forms for even and like odd and even for natural numbers. There might be forms like for virtue. There might be a form for virtue. There's a whole dialogue on on the form of virtue. It's called the Meno. Right. So um, whether we're talking about something concrete or something abstract, um, the property, whether it's abstract or concrete, we say that particular individuals instantiate these properties. Um, the properties, however, seem to exist over and above the objects that instantiate them. So here's the interesting thing, right? If these properties that we refer to with abstract reference actually exist mind independently, for example, in the way that Plato thought they did, then they would be what we call universals, which can be instantiated by various individual things. Particulars aren't instantiated. Well, particular objects are what instantiate the properties, right? So, this green, that other green, and that other green over there, are all different instantiations of a universal. And universals, depending on who you ask, right? If you ask somebody like Plato, exist over and above the things themselves. But particulars are more unique. Maybe we can try and cash this out with some more examples, getting beyond, green fruits and vegetables and so forth. Yeah, let's define a particular and let's pick a different universal for our particular to instantiate. So I need a universal, any universal. Let's go with something more abstract. What about courage? Right? Courage is mentioned in the book. Courage is I don't know, could be a virtue. Not the virtue, but courage is probably a virtue. So let's say that there's this universal courage, and there might be lots of particulars, particular individuals, beings who instantiate that property, right? So I believe Crumley, talks about the soldier, right, who fights bravely in a battle, instantiates the property courageousness. So that would be a particular. But then maybe somewhere else in the world, the firefighter who charges into the burning building despite great risk to themselves, uh, they're also courageous, right? So particulars are what they don't instantiate they cannot be instantiated themselves, but they're like the particular instantiations of the universal. It's the universal being instantiated, courage in this case, right? So universals, think of universals as like if you want to think of it along the lines that Plato did, you can think of them as analogous to forms. Um, and if not, you can think of them like categories, right? I mean, it sounds pretty tricky when we're talking about stuff that's abstract, but think about, I don't know, car, right? The category car, right? I can look out my window and there's a car. Okay, there's a particular car parked in front of my apartment. It's a gray Tesla. And then in the driveway here is a blue Ford hatchback. And in the other one, there's a white kind of like SUV kind of thing. And then over there, I can see yet other cars. So those are all the individual cars, but they belong to this category. And that category we could think of as, for our purposes here, a universal, a type of thing, being a car. If you, being a car is a property, I guess we could say you have if you have wheels, an engine of some kind, and people drive you, right? So all of these different cars. There goes another one. There's a sort of I don't know what color that is, but it's a Mazda. Just drove by, right? So these are all individuals, but they're part of a broader class, which for our purposes we could think of as a universal. Yeah, yeah, Kara's got it. That's a very good summary. So yeah, like if you think of um universals as these properties. The attribute agreement comes when many different individuals instantiate that property. This is called multiple instantiability, right? So if if I have a car that's red, a truck that's red, but also a shirt that's red, or a pair of shoes that are red, there's attribute agreement in that uh they all share in that they're instantiating the same property, redness. But redness exists in the abstract over and above the shoe, the truck, the shirt, right? Like I said, maybe this will become clearer if we talk about Plato a little further. But Plato, oh, excuse me, as I mentioned earlier, um understands these things in terms of the perfect forms, or sometimes ideas. So, from the Republic, the character Socrates is having a conversation with the character Glaucon. Now, Glaucon, Socrates was Plato's teacher, so we have a character Socrates, but Glaucon was Plato's brother. So we have Socrates' teacher talking, or Plato's teacher talking to Plato's brother here. Now, Socrates says, "We speak of many beautiful things and many good things, and we say that they are so and so and define them in speech." Glaucon replies, "We do." Then Socrates says, "And beauty itself and goodness itself, and so with all the things which we then class as many, we now class them again according to some form of each." And Glaucon agrees, saying that is so. So there are, Socrates is saying, many good things, many beautiful things, but we all group them as such according to the form of the good or the beautiful, right? You could have a particularly good, and this is where things kind of get really abstract, right? You could, if you're in ancient Greece, right? Maybe you have a particularly good chariot, right? If you're a wealthy Athenian, you probably have access to a really good chariot and really good horses, perhaps. And maybe you even have a really good philosophy teacher. So all of these things share the attribute, they agree in their attribute of goodness. Um, and we understand these things because we can grasp in some measure the form of the good, right? Which exists over and above these particular good things. So is everybody following so far? And again, if something like Okay, good. Yeah. If something like if something like the good or virtue is too abstract, try and think of a concrete example, right? Like the cars outside of my window or trees. I've got some trees out here, right? I've got a couple of chestnut trees and a maple tree. Um, and if you wanted to, you could say, well, if tree is the universal class, then these three individuals are, um, I guess, particular instances, right? Um, yeah, so for Jonathan, not for Plato. Um, Plato would argue that no, there is actually an objective standard for goodness, and it's the form of the good. Now, that's what Plato would say. Not everyone would agree with him. Genus and species. Yeah, this is kind of more in line with an Aristotelian approach, um, which we're making our way toward. Quinn says, "What happens if something doesn't properly fit in the universal but still has the most of the properties?" Well, again, we're gonna get there. There's this idea of family resemblance, uh, which Ludwig Wittgenstein discusses in the philosophical investigations. Hmm. What we're talking about now is very much in line with what we call the classical view of concepts. But the family resemblance view is a bit different, and it's kind of exactly what it sounds like. But we'll get there. I don't want to get ahead of myself. Um, let's see. So universals can either be adjective describing something or the idea of a noun. Um, well, no, actually, they're always the noun, but in an abstract sense. They're not, um, like an instantiation of a universal is maybe an adjective. Um, like if I say that the sweater is red, right? Um, but redness itself is a noun, right? So the universal, um, again, if you're like a realist, the universal exists over and above um, the particular thing, right? And yeah, it's tempting to think of it in terms of like nouns and adjectives and stuff, but try and think of it in terms of objects and their properties. So the objects are the individuals and they instantiate certain properties. And if you're a realist like Plato, those properties exist separately in a sense from the objects that instantiate them. So like Plato was saying here, there might be like a really good human, right? Or a really good chariot or a really good horse. They're all good. They all have something in common, which is goodness, which they must get from the good, the form of the good. So this is realism. Um, in fact, sometimes we call it Platonic realism. But as I was about to explain earlier, right, the terminology with Plato it can get a little bit weird. Philosophers are a little bit inconsistent about this. I've seen Plato referred to as an idealist because the forms are ideal in the sense that they're perfect. But they're not ideal in the sense that they're mind dependent. I mean, we can understand them with the mind. In fact, that's how uh, Plato thinks that Plato's a rationalist, right? So really, to understand the forms, well, we're actually born with innate knowledge of the forms, according to Plato, but we forget because of the trauma of birth. And so it's like we have the knowledge prior to birth and we forget. And then we have to recollect our knowledge of the forms by doing philosophy. So, yeah, sometimes you hear it described like in terms of idealism, but I don't think that's quite right. So we call this Platonic realism because the forms for Plato are the most real thing. If you read, I've made this recommendation to a few of you who are working on your essay, and maybe some of you have already read it, but if you read The Allegory of the Cave from the Republic, which describes the philosopher's journey, right? The shadows on the cave wall are like our world that we inhabit now. And we are mistaken, according to Plato, if we think that the shadows are real, the mere appearances, the phenomena, right? The forms are what are really real for Plato, and they kind of cast the shadows onto the cave wall. So this cup is but a shadow of the perfect form of the cup. So Plato, a Platonic realist, also what we could call a strong realist about um, about these things. Time for a refill. So one moment, please. Okie dokie, that's better. So we have realism, strong realism on the extreme end where universals exist, kind of over and above particular things, and maybe they're more real than the particular things themselves. But on the opposite end is something we call nominalism. So nominalism says that universals don't exist. There are only particular things that exist. And we can talk about them like this thing is red, that thing is red, that thing is red, but there's no redness that exists separately from these particular things. And this is associated with William of Ockham, who is a medieval philosopher from England. There are also some views somewhere in the middle, right? Moderate realism has it that universals exist, but they are in the objects, not separate from the objects. And this is Aristotle's idea. And then there's conceptualism, which comes from Peter Abelard, a French medieval philosopher. And he says that universals are concepts. So they're just in the mind, right? They're universal in that we can say, this thing is green, that thing is green, and that thing is green, and they all have this property of greenness. But green, unlike for Plato, which exists as some like, I don't know, ideal form, perfect form of the green, for Abelard, that it's just an idea in your mind. So someone in the chat asked about that earlier. Like, so are these concepts just like perfect mental concepts or categories? Not for Plato, but yes, for Abelard. So let's talk more about realism. So I don't know, like let's put some feelers out there before we do so. Um, what do we think? Any strong realists? You can remain sort of agnostic about this if you want. I saw a Reddit post the other day, something from Reddit philosophy. Anyway, the person in the post was railing against universal categories like these don't exist. Why do we have these? And blah blah blah. And anyway, the caption was "Bro just discovered nominalism." Nominalists and realists, I guess we'll say, are on the extreme ends of these of the spectrum of the reality of universals, we could say. That's fine, yeah. Yeah, there's something appealing about his. 'Cause like what does it mean like okay, like courage exists kind of over and above courageous individuals? Like what? Right? I don't know. I can also kind of throw my weight behind Aristotle, but we're going to be covering Aristotle and Abelard next time on Thursday. Um, let's talk more about realism. If you're a realist like Plato, you would say that universals are independently existing. So I can destroy an instance of a universal, but I haven't destroyed the universal itself. Yeah, like I get it, Quinn. It's like all these things that we're talking about as universals, are these maybe not just ideas, like concepts, right? And that's probably going to be appealing to a lot of people. And that's it, and it's fair, right? I don't think you're going to find, I think if you go out and look, you're not going to find a whole lot of Platonic realists, although they are out there. A lot of mathematicians, for example, are Platonic realists about numbers, right? The numbers, like here's an interesting question. If you're trying to decide between being a realist or some other alternative, do numbers exist? So like I can have two objects, like okay, here's two fingers, and over there are two cars. And at certain times in the trees here, there are two squirrels. In fact, of these trees, two of them are chestnut trees. So these are all instances of the number two. Does the number two exist independently of, the groups of objects that are, that we could count up to two, up to two of? Yeah, I mean, you're going to get various answers, but a lot of mathematicians would say that the number two is real, right? Well, some would say that, yes, but if you talk to somebody like Roger Penrose, who's a Platonist about numbers, right, they would say um, that numbers really exist beyond the objects that we use numbers to count. So let's say I eat my green apple. I've destroyed the apple. I've absolutely destroyed it, but I haven't destroyed the color green. I've destroyed an instance of it, sure, but not the color itself. A realist would even say if I destroyed all the green objects in the universe, the universal green would still exist. So, as Crumley says, even though universals and the instances of universals are different, the universal is wholly present in each instance. Yeah, this is realism. It's kind of like to go back to the idea of numbers, right? A realist about numbers would say that even if there was only like one object in the universe or no objects in the universe, numbers would still exist. That's what a realist would say. Um, Even if I destroyed all the green objects in the universe, green, the universal green would still exist. That's what a realist would say. And again, the universals are present in each instance. And that's not exactly like being a member of a class or a category, right? Like you're all members of this class, but the entire class is not present in you. So that's something to keep in mind. It's a subtle difference, but universals, and I know I made the loose analogy with categories and members of categories before. But being a part of a category or a class is different from being a universal if you are a realist. You mean a not like what would a nominalist say? A nominalist would say that no, there isn't even any there aren't universals. There are just lots of green objects. We're overcomplicating things, they would say. And we'll get there. A lot of realists also don't think that the universals are physical. So they're not made out of anything, not made of matter or energy. They don't take up any space. Um, yeah, so a universal can be instantiated, whereas being a member of a category is kind of just like being put into a group, maybe based on the properties that you instantiate. Like I could go and gather up a bunch of green objects and say these are all the green things. Um, and then I've got a sort of class of green things. Um, or like someone mentioned genus and species earlier. That's probably the best way to understand it. Like, would you combine universally? Well, no. For our purposes, just think of just like let's not overcomplicate things. Let's just stick to the universal, like the color universal. But you could, I guess, um, you could make a class or a category of green cars if you wanted to. Would that be real? Would that exist independently over and above each individual green car? I guess if you're a realist. Um, yeah, the universal is what is instantiated by the individuals. So to like take it like this, right? To continue with our discussion of universals not being physical, they can be instantiated, um, say within the same object or within lots of different objects. So this is called multiple instantiability, right? And we've already seen this. So the universal green can be instantiated by all the Granny Smith apples at the grocery store or by Kermit the Frog or by the grass over there, which is still green. It hasn't turned brown or become covered in snow yet. Um, Another interesting consequences of senses being non-physical or of universals being non-physical, and this is where I think some of the confusion of Plato on with Plato comes in, is that we don't know about them via the senses. We know about them via the intellect. So universals, if they're like abstract objects that exist over and above particulars, um, then we have to grasp them with the intellect. And that's what we see in like Plato's dialogues, right? When Plato is having Socrates talk with whoever he's talking to that day, because Socrates is talking to everybody. Um, uh, he's trying to understand the intelligible, well, maybe I shouldn't use that term. He's trying to use the intellect to grasp the true nature of reality, ultimate reality, and that's the forms, because the forms are more real uh, than than everything else. Yeah, that's what they say. Um, I mean, Plato, okay, so a bit of a background, right? Plato is trained in, among other things, geometry. The Greeks were way into geometry. And so, Plato's sitting there doing math, drawing triangles, say. Um, Maybe he's drawing on a slate, you have a piece of some kind of stone, well, literally slate, and drawing on it with chalk. Or you could have a stick and you're drawing in the sand. Right? The Greeks had lots of different ways of doing math on erasable surfaces, right? They were really into geometry. Geometry was very important to them. In fact, in Plato's Academy, it was inscribed above the door, not one person untutored in geometry, as which means like to go there, you to study philosophy, you first had to have studied geometry, right? So Plato's doing geometry and he's drawing his triangles and doing calculations and so on and so forth. Now, Plato can draw triangles till the cows come home. He's never going to draw a perfect triangle, like one that's absolutely perfect with like perfectly straight lines, perfect internal angles that all sum to 180 degrees, right? No matter how nice of a slate user or stick illustrator he is or develops, no matter his skills, he's never going to encounter a perfect triangle. But he can understand the perfect triangle. Like there must be a triangle with perfectly straight lines and perfect angles, like absolutely perfect. But he doesn't know that via the senses. He knows it via the intellect. Um, See what I mean? Right? Is everybody following me? So that's where Plato starts to think like, okay, there must be a perfect form of the triangle that's more perfect than any triangle I can draw. And all the triangles must get their reality from this perfect triangle. So that's what Plato kind of has in mind. Here's another example. Virtue. Again, from the Meno, different dialogue than the Republic, much shorter, and a very fun read. Socrates and Meno are sort of asking each other about virtue, and Socrates says to Meno, I seem to be in luck. I wanted one virtue, and I find that you have a whole swarm of virtues to offer. This is a point in the dialogue where, Socrates is like, Meno comes to Socrates, and he's like, What do you think about virtue, Socrates? Like, is it teachable? Can we teach the youth to be virtuous? And of course, Socrates, first thing he does is like, I don't know. I don't know, Meno. Why don't you tell me what you think virtue is? And so Meno names lots of different virtues. So maybe um, being courageous is a virtue, being strong is a virtue, having justice, a sense of justice, right? He names all of these virtues, and that's when Socrates says, I seem to be in luck. I wanted one virtue, and I find that you have a whole swarm of virtues to offer. But seriously, to carry on this metaphor of the swarm, suppose I asked you what a bee is, and what is its essential nature, and you replied that bees were of many different kinds. What would you say if I went on to ask, and is it in being bees that they are many and various and different from one another? Or would you agree that it is not in this respect that they differ? Then do the same with virtues. Even if they are many and various, yet at least they all have some common character which makes them virtues. So we could name, courageousness, wisdom, justice, strength. All of these are virtues, but what do they all have in common that makes them virtues? That's what Socrates wants to know. He wants to know about the universal form of virtue, right? So Socrates is relying on these ideas we started with, abstract reference and attribute agreement, right? Um, like we identify certain categories of things as such because they share a common set of attributes, right? In my slides, right, I can say that, we identify dogs as dogs because they share certain sets of attributes that they don't share with other creatures. Um, And Socrates wants to know what it is that all of the virtues have in common that make them virtues. And if you agree with Socrates, then you've got to acknowledge the existence of universals. Like if you want to be a Platonist, you've got to believe in universals, right? Um, so universals are very important for realists because realists say that the meaning, oh my goodness, the meaning of sentences like, I don't know, courage is a virtue, or wisdom is a virtue, or temperance is a virtue. Um, these sentences get their meaning from the universal, from virtue. So, if you're a Platonist, you're a strong realist, and you believe that the forms are that the universals are the perfect forms, which not only exist independently of the particular of their particular instantiations, um, they're actually more real. They're the most real thing. So we say that this is the argument, the argument that or the arguments that realists are relying on in order to establish the existence of universals. One is the argument from attribute agreement. We need universals to explain attribute agreement, right? Like Kermit the Frog is green, this apple is green, this unripened tomato is green, that shirt over there is green. How do we explain why these attributes or how these attributes agree with one another? Well, it's because there's a universal green or greenness, and it's being multiply instantiated in all these individual objects. And the argument from abstract reference says that we need universals to explain the meanings of sentences that use abstract reference, right? But there is a problem. Third man argument, which Plato introduces himself in a later dialogue, Parmenides. So Plato here has a young Socrates talking with a pre-Socratic philosopher named Parmenides. And we arrive at the third man argument, um, which is about a problem that arises with accepting attribute agreement. Basically, the argument from attribute agreement leads to an infinite regress. So, very simply, let's say that there are two large objects, okay? Now, a strong realist is going to say that they're large because each of them instantiates that property, largeness. So they agree in their attributes. So I might have two very large things. I don't know. What are some large things? House. Yeah, house is pretty large. Mountains good. Elephant. I was thinking of an elephant. Apartment buildings. Yeah. I saw this one picture. It was of a ship near a shore, like a massive, massive container ship. And it messed with my brain. Just to see this how big this ship was compared to all these little houses in the foreground, right? But yeah, let's say yeah, Jeff Bezos's net value. Yeah, well, let's say let's say house and elephant. Okay? So I got an elephant and I got a house. Two very different kinds of things. But they're both large, and they agree in their attributes of largeness because they both instantiate the property of largeness. Now here's the problem. Now take largeness by itself, Parmenides says in the dialogue. And the other things which are large. So my house and my elephant. Suppose you look at all these in the same way in your mind's eye. Will not yet another unity make its appearance, a largeness, another universal, by virtue of which they all appear large? So it would seem, replies Socrates. If so, a second form of largeness will present itself over and above largeness itself, and the things that share in it. And again, covering all these, yet another, which will make all of them large. So each of your forms will no longer be one, but an indefinite number. So it's like this, right? If I have my house and my elephant, like what is it that these have in common? Well, largeness. So there must be a form of largeness, um, which the elephant and the house share in somehow. Um, so the attributes of the house and the elephant and the form, all agree with one another. But now, hang on. Parmenides is saying we need another form of largeness to get the house and the elephant. Oh, excuse me. And the previous form of largeness to agree with one another. Um, Maybe. I'm not sure. I'm not sure, Remy. That's a really good question. I've never thought about that. Well, maybe Parmenides is being a bit of a relativist. I mean, Parmenides is not like Plato, who thinks that there are these perfect forms. Parmenides thinks of things as much more changeable. Um, Yeah, it does. It does, Kara. But the problem that Parmenides is saying exists here is that to get all of these to agree with one another, we need yet another form of largeness. So look, we invoke universals, as I say down here in the slides, to explain the similarities, the agreement, the attribute agreement between individuals, right? So we, in this case, we have our house and our elephant, and we postulate the largeness universal to explain why the house and the elephant and all the other large things are alike. What Parmenides is saying is that now what we would need is a third um, or fourth or fifth universal to explain the likeness between all the large things and the first universal largeness itself. And then if we need a second universal, we'd need a third to explain the likeness of the second to the first, and so on and so on and so on ad infinitum to infinity. So yes, like the largeness, as you say, the form of largeness applies to the house and the elephant. The form of largeness actually applies to all large objects. But what is it that makes the form of largeness resemble all of the particular instances of largeness? Well, now we need another form for that. And then we need another form to make that form resemble the first form. And so on and so on and so on. And that's what Parmenides is worried about here. And yeah, that's called the third man argument. Okay, so what is it that the house and the elephant have in common? They're big, yeah. So what is it that the form of if we're realists, if we're strong realists, they're both large because they get their largeness from a form, right? I guess if you're used to thinking and this is the way that I was taught about Plato, but the individuals that exemplify certain properties participate in the forms somehow, or are cast like shadows by the forms. But here the argument is particularly about attribute agreement. So if I'm going to say, if I'm using the argument from attribute agreement to argue for the existence of a form, like it's easy to get things mixed up, right? Like I can say, like, okay, things get their largeness from the form of the large. Okay, sure, cool. But how do I know that form exists? Well, there's the argument for attribute agreement. All of these things are large. They agree in this attribute. So therefore, like, look, if we go back, the argument from attribute agreement says that universals are necessary to explain attribute agreement. So here, I'm not using universals to explain forms. I'm invoking universals to explain, or I'm not using forms to explain particulars. I'm invoking universals as a theoretical object to explain attribute agreement. And the third man argument is particularly, excuse the pun, about this argument from attribute agreement. So if I'm like using abduction, if I'm arguing to the best explanation, how is it that we explain why all these little different particular individuals agree in their attributes? If I'm arguing from that there is a universal, that's when the third man argument becomes important. Because then you can say, like, well, you can invoke a universal to explain why all of these attributes agree with one another, but now you have the problem of explaining how all these attributes agree with the universal, and you need another universal for that. So it's particularly to do with the argument from attribute agreement. Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah, Remy, you're right. It is relative, right? And I don't know what Plato would do about that. But yeah, like I would just say like the way we were talking about forms earlier, getting back to Kara's question, the way we were talking about forms earlier from a Platonic perspective is that these forms kind of um are what imbue the phenomena, the what is seen in our world with reality. Almost like the forms are a cause of the objects that exist in our world. And that is true if like on Plato's thinking. Like, and if you want, go and read the allegory of the cave in the Republic. And you've got your prisoners who are chained up in the cave, and they see shadows on the wall, which are cast by objects being carried back and forth between the prisoners and a fire. So the light from the fire casts shadows on the wall, and the prisoners give these shadows names, and they think that these are the real objects, but they're not. They're just phenomena. Um, and the objects that are casting the shadows, well, those are the forms. Those are what are really real. So there's a sense in which the forms, i.e., universals, are the cause of the phenomenal world, right? But when it comes to the argument from attribute agreement, that's where the third man argument comes into play. So if you're going to say like we need to invoke universals to explain why there is attribute agreement, you're facing an infinite regress. That's what Parmenides is saying. Think about it, reread it as necessary. Okay? Realists also want to address the one over many problem by invoking universals, right? The problem of attribute agreement. Um, but this is actually the cause of the third ban argument, right? The one over many problem. How do we know that there is, one universal, um, uh, or how best to explain attribute agreement? Well, we'll invoke universals. We'll invoke one universal over many particular things, right? But what Parmenides is saying with this third man argument is that even with universals, um, you're going to have to invoke another universal to explain the resemblance between the particular attributes and the first universal. And it's just going to keep going on like that. You can also think of it like this, right? Here's the way I've got it here. A universal could be like the particulars or not like the particulars. If it is like the particulars, then we get the third man argument. So, um, all of the large things, whether it's houses and elephants, mountains, planets, stars, right? Whatever we decide is large, um, we say these are all alike in the sense that they um, they get they get their largeness from a universal, right? But if we say that that's because the universal is like, if largeness is like all of the large things, well, now we need a new universal to explain the resemblance between largeness itself and all of the large objects. So that's the third man argument. But universals, we don't want to say that they are like their particulars in this way. Like the form of largeness is not actually large, right? So then if the universal is not like its particulars, then what's important? Maybe what's important are the relations, get myself out of the way here, the relations between the universal and its particular instances. Oh, there's a typo there, but ignore the typo. So now maybe we need another universal which covers each particular relation between the universal and its different instances. So either way, we get the third man argument, right? It arises whether we say that the universals are like their particulars or not like their particulars and are just related to them in some important way. Now, just in case you're confused, just in case you're like, what the heck? I'm lost. I don't know how to think about all of this. Well, that's okay because Plato himself doesn't really settle on how to solve these problems, right? Um, he kind of acknowledges that, like, okay, so he has the character Parmenides argue with Socrates, like, hey, but what about all these problems? There's the third man argument, the one over many problem. How can we really deal with this? I don't know. But on the other hand, we kind of need universals to think and speak and do all of the stuff we do and do all of our philosophy, right? So, Parmenides says here, but on the other hand, if in view of all these difficulties and other things like them, a man refuses to admit that the form of things exist or to distinguish a definite form in every case, he will have nothing on which to fix his thought, so long as he will not allow that each thing has a character which is always the same. In so doing, will completely destroy the significance of all discourse. But of that consequence, I think you, Socrates, pointing to Socrates, are all too well aware. So Parmenides is saying, like, look, we need um, we need something that anchors our thoughts, something unchangeable, unfixed, or fixed. Oh, that's another typo in my slides. Oh, goodness. This should say fixed and unchangeable fixes the meaning of our references to different properties. So I need an idea of green, in order to fix my thinking and speaking about all of the particular green objects. I need some kind of perfect, unchangeable idea of green. Despite the problems of the third man argument, right? I still need this sort of concept of green, and I need this for everything, right? I need my concepts to make sense, to think, to speak, to talk about anything with other people. We all need our concepts. So, Parmenides spends a good bit of the dialogue discussing with Socrates about the problems with Platonic realism. And then at the end, kind of throws his hands up and says, well, all these problems aside, we still need something like the forms. Otherwise, we can't think about anything or talk about anything or do philosophy, right? Baylis says something similar. He says the existence of communicable knowledge requires shared meanings. Such knowledge, in its simplest form, is knowledge of the common characters exhibited by various objects and events. Our problem is to explain universals' nature and their function in knowledge in terms that are neither mystical nor false to the facts of conscious communication. Um, so he's not as well, he says it, right? He's not as mystical as Plato, as I can use that, if I can use that term. But he sees something like the forms or universals as necessary. Um, they help explain how we can think and talk, and they anchor our shared knowledge. I mean, think about it, right? If if we're all in the room, if in the same room, and I say, look at the green object, we all have to have some idea of what green is in order for us to all look at the same object, right? Or any other concept or any other category, really. Like when I asked you to think about something large, yes, there is a sort of relativism there, but all of you picked things that were, I would say, large: elephants, houses, mountains, etc. Right? That's because you have a concept of largeness. Okay. Um, I can't believe this set of slides was so short, and yet there was so much covered. But it's actually a little bit past the end of class, so we should wrap up now. Um, as usual, don't be intimidated if this is very abstract or tricky to think about. Um, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. But yeah, if the third man argument's probably the most difficult part of all of this. If the third man argument is giving you a bit of trouble, just reread and rethink. And of course, if you have any questions about the essay assignment, you should email me, okay? Because it's due in less than a month. Only has to be 12 to 1500 words long. But remember, don't procrastinate. Get to work on it early, and if you need a hand, let me know. All right, so that's it for today. I mean, 5 pages is nothing. My master's thesis was 154 pages long. I mean, 5 pages is tiny. Um, so I'll see you all next time on Thursday. And in the meantime, take care of yourselves. Okay, bye for now. Well, thanks, everybody.